Carl Jung explained, 6 hidden signs the soul is releasing. What no longer serves Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the unconscious mind or dream interpretation. It was about the soul's secret rebellion against everything we think we need to survive. This isn't metaphysical nonsense or New Age fantasy. This is documented psychological process that Jung witnessed in thousands of patients and experienced himself during his near-psychotic breakdown between 1913 and 1919. Most people interpret the signs of soul release as personal failure, mental illness, or cosmic punishment. They fight against it with therapy, medication, and desperate attempts to rebuild what's crumbling around them. They're missing the most sophisticated psychological operation known to human consciousness. Jung called this process the transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to sacrifice the ego's attachments for the self's greater wholeness. It's not something that happens to you. It's something your deepest intelligence does for you. But here's what terrifies most people. The soul actively destroys what we think we need in order to give us what we actually need. Your comfortable job that suddenly feels meaningless, your stable relationship that now feels like acting in a play, that growing sense that your entire life belongs to someone else. These aren't signs that something is wrong with you. These are signs that something is finally going right. Jung discovered that we become possessed by what we refuse to release, and when the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are becomes too wide for the psyche to sustain, the soul begins its liberation process. Tonight, you'll discover the 6 hidden signs that your soul is actively dismantling your false life to make space for your authentic existence. You'll learn why recognizing these signs could be the difference between psychological breakdown and spiritual breakthrough. And you'll understand why Jung believed this process isn't just inevitable for anyone seeking genuine existence. It's absolutely necessary. The question isn't whether this will happen to you. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it does, and whether you'll have the courage to collaborate with your own transformation instead of fighting against it. Because here's what Jung learned through his own descent into what he called the land of the dead. The soul never releases what serves your growth. It only releases what imprisons your becoming. Your panic attacks during important meetings aren't mental illness. They're your soul's refusal to participate in a performance that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Your sudden loss of interest in goals that used to motivate you isn't depression. It's your authentic self withdrawing its energy from investments that were never truly yours. Your growing sense that you're living someone else's life isn't delusion. It's the first glimpse of clarity you've had in years. Jung observed this pattern across cultures, across centuries, across every type of human being who dared to live authentically rather than safely. The soul release process follows the same archetypal stages, whether you're a corporate executive in Manhattan or a shepherd in the Swiss Alps. But modern psychology has pathologized what ancient wisdom traditions understood as sacred initiation. We treat the symptoms instead of recognizing the transformation. We medicate the messenger instead of listening to the message. Jung spent 6 years documenting his own soul release process in what became known as the Red Book. He recorded visions, dialogues with inner figures, and experiences that nearly convinced him he was going insane. But he made a revolutionary choice. Instead of fighting against these experiences, he engaged with them consciously. Instead of trying to return to his previous life, he allowed his soul to show him who he was beyond his professional identity, his social roles, and his rational mind. That decision didn't just transform Jung's life. It gave birth to analytical psychology and provided humanity with tools for navigating the most challenging passages of human existence. The same process that nearly destroyed Jung became his greatest gift to the world. And the same process that might be dismantling your life right now could be your soul's way of preparing you for your most authentic contribution to humanity, but only if you recognize what's actually happening. Only if you understand that your soul isn't trying to punish you or break you down. It's trying to set you free from a prison you've been living in for so long that you've forgotten it's not your real home. The 6 signs you'll learn tonight aren't symptoms to be eliminated. They're communications to be understood. They're invitations from your deepest self to step into the life you came here to live, instead of the life you think you're supposed to live. Jung discovered that the soul speaks through disruption, through dissatisfaction, through the gradual or sudden withdrawal of life energy from everything that doesn't serve your authentic becoming. Most people interpret this as cosmic cruelty. Jung understood it as cosmic intelligence. Your soul knows who you are beyond every mask you've learned to wear. It knows what you're capable of beyond every limitation you've accepted, and it knows what you need to release in order to become who you're meant to be. The process might feel like dying. Jung himself described it as a kind of death. The death of false identity, the death of borrowed dreams, the death of survival strategies that have outlived their usefulness. But on the other side of that death is not emptiness. On the other side is the most authentic version of yourself you've ever encountered. The question is, are you ready to meet who you actually are when everything you think you are falls away? Are you ready to discover what your life looks like when it's powered by authentic purpose instead of borrowed expectations? Are you ready to understand why your soul might be dismantling everything you've built in order to clear space for everything you're meant to create? Because once you recognize these 6 signs, once you understand what's actually happening in your psychological depths, you can't go back to unconscious living. You can't pretend that your dissatisfaction is just a phase, or that your growing authenticity is just rebellion. You'll know that your soul is calling you home to yourself, and you'll have to decide whether you'll answer that call or spend the rest of your life in exile from your own truth. Jung believed this choice between authentic existence and unconscious survival is the most important decision any human being ever makes. Everything else in your life flows from how you respond when your soul begins its release process. Tonight, you'll learn to recognize that process not as breakdown, but as breakthrough, not as failure, but as initiation into the most important work you'll ever do, becoming who you actually are. Modern psychology has it completely backward. We treat attachment as healthy and letting go as loss, but Jung discovered the opposite truth. We become possessed by what we refuse to release. This isn't ordinary attachment to people, places, or things. This is a specific form of unconscious possession where individuals become so identified with external structures, careers, relationships, identities, beliefs, that their soul begins to suffocate under the weight of false investments. Jung identified this as one of the most dangerous psychological conditions of modern life. Soul possession through over-identification with roles that were never meant to define us. Think about it. How many people do you know who can't answer the question, "Who are you?" without immediately listing their job title, relationship status, or social roles? I'm a lawyer. I'm a mother. I'm a Christian. I'm successful. I'm struggling. But who are you when all of those external identifiers are stripped away? Who are you in the silence between thoughts, in the space between breaths, in the moment before you put on the mask the world expects you to wear? Most people have no idea, and that's exactly where soul possession takes hold. Jung observed that when we lose contact with our authentic self, we unconsciously fuse with whatever external structure promises us identity, security, or meaning. We don't just play the role, we become the role. We don't just do the job, we are the job. This isn't healthy attachment, this is psychological possession in its most subtle and sophisticated form. Here's how it works. You start a career, enter a relationship, or adopt a belief system that genuinely serves your growth at that stage of life. It provides structure, meaning, and social connection. Your ego feels safe and your life feels manageable. But gradually, unconsciously, you begin to derive your entire sense of identity from these external structures. Your worth becomes tied to your performance. Your safety becomes dependent on maintaining these roles perfectly. Your very existence begins to feel threatened by any suggestion that these structures might be temporary or incomplete. Jung called this provisional living, organizing your entire existence around roles and identities that were only meant to serve you temporarily, not define you permanently. And here's where the soul's rebellion begins. Your authentic self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, watches this process with growing concern. It sees you becoming smaller and smaller, more rigid and defensive, less creative and spontaneous. It observes you sacrificing your natural gifts and authentic responses to maintain external structures that no longer serve your growth. The self doesn't judge this process. It understands that ego development and social adaptation are necessary stages of psychological development, but it also knows when these stages have outlived their usefulness and begun to imprison rather than liberate your authentic nature. That's when the soul release process begins. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't a gentle suggestion or a subtle invitation. This is the psyche's emergency protocol for preventing complete spiritual suffocation. Jung observed that the soul's release mechanism activates when the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are becomes too wide for the psyche to sustain. The tension between authentic being and false identity creates what he called a psychological complexion, a splitting of consciousness that can't be maintained indefinitely without serious consequences. The soul begins to withdraw its life energy from external structures that have become prisons instead of vehicles for growth. But because most people are completely identified with these structures, they experience this withdrawal as depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, or existential crisis. They feel like they're dying. In a sense, they are. The false self that they've confused with their identity is indeed dying, but they don't recognize the difference between ego death and actual death, between the dissolution of false identity and the destruction of authentic being. So they fight the process. They go to therapy to figure out how to feel passionate about their career again. They take medication to suppress the anxiety that's actually their soul's wisdom trying to get their attention. They force themselves back into relationships and situations that their authentic self has already outgrown. Jung called this the neurotic solution, using all of your psychological energy to maintain structures that are actively preventing your growth, while treating the symptoms of soul imprisonment as if they were the problem itself. But the soul doesn't give up easily. If gentle withdrawal doesn't get your attention, it escalates. Mysterious health problems that doctors can't diagnose, panic attacks in situations that used to feel routine, insomnia that arrives precisely when you try to force yourself back into old patterns, relationship conflicts that seem to come out of nowhere. These aren't random misfortunes or signs that something is wrong with you. These are your soul's increasingly desperate attempts to prevent you from spending another day in psychological prison. Jung documented case after case of individuals who ignored these early warning signs and found themselves facing what appeared to be complete life collapse, job loss, divorce, health crises, financial difficulties, social isolation. But here's what he discovered that revolutionized psychology. In every case where individuals learned to work with their soul's release process instead of against it, what appeared to be breakdown became breakthrough. What seemed like destruction became liberation. The key was recognizing that the soul never releases what serves your authentic growth. It only releases what imprisons your becoming. Your soul won't take away your capacity for meaningful work, but it might dismantle your identification with a specific job title. It won't destroy your ability to love, but it might end relationships where you've lost contact with your authentic self. It won't eliminate your spiritual nature, but it might release you from religious structures that have become too small for your expanding consciousness. The problem is that most people can't tell the difference between what they are and what they do, between who they are and how they function in the world. So when the soul begins its release process, they experience it as an attack on their very existence. Jung understood that this confusion between being and doing, between self and role, is one of the primary sources of psychological suffering in modern life. We've been conditioned to find our identity in external achievements rather than internal authenticity, but the soul operates according to different principles. It's not interested in your resume or your social status. It's not impressed by your accomplishments or threatened by your failures. It knows you as you were before you learned to perform for approval, and it holds the vision of who you're meant to become after you remember how to live from authentic being rather than borrowed identity. The soul release process is how your deepest intelligence rescues you from a life of unconscious imprisonment. But because we've been taught to fear change, uncertainty, and the unknown, we interpret this rescue operation as persecution. We go to therapy to figure out how to stop the process instead of learning how to collaborate with it. We seek medication to suppress the symptoms instead of understanding the message. We frantically try to rebuild what's crumbling instead of recognizing that some structures need to crumble for new growth to occur. Jung spent his entire career trying to help people understand this distinction, the difference between resistance that serves growth and resistance that prevents it, between holding on that creates strength and holding on that creates suffering. The soul knows this difference instinctively. That's why it releases only what has become too small for your expanding consciousness, only what has shifted from vehicle to prison, only what no longer serves your authentic becoming. But the ego, identified with external structures and terrified of change, experiences every release as a threat to its survival. It doesn't understand that what's dying isn't your true self. It's the collection of roles, expectations, and identities that have been preventing you from meeting your true self. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of learning to distinguish between the ego and the self, between temporary identity and authentic being, between what you do and who you are. Without this discrimination, the soul release process feels like annihilation. With this understanding, it becomes the most important work you'll ever do, collaborating with your own transformation instead of fighting against it. The question isn't whether your soul will begin this process. If you're seeking authentic existence, if you're committed to growth rather than just comfort, it's inevitable. The question is whether you'll recognize what's happening when it begins, and whether you'll have the courage to let go of what you think you need in order to receive what you actually need. Because on the other side of soul release isn't emptiness or chaos. On the other side is the most authentic, creative, and purposeful version of yourself you've ever encountered. But you can't get there by holding on to the identity that brought you to this point. You can only get there by trusting your soul's intelligence to clear the path toward who you're meant to become. Meet Sarah Chen, a 42-year-old corporate executive whose story illustrates exactly how the soul's release process unfolds when we're too identified with external success to recognize what's actually happening in our psychological depths. On paper, Sarah had achieved everything she was supposed to want. Senior Vice President of Strategy at a Fortune 500 company, six-figure salary with stock options, corner office with a view of the Manhattan skyline, marriage to a successful attorney, two children in private school, vacation home in the Hamptons. She was the definition of having it all together. But at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, Sarah found herself sitting in her car in the company parking garage, unable to enter the building where she had worked for 12 years. Her hands were shaking, her heart was racing, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. This wasn't the first sign. The soul's release process had been sending her messages for months, but she had interpreted every signal as a problem to be solved, rather than communication to be understood. It started with what she called the great numbness. Work that had once energized her began to feel mechanical and meaningless. She would sit in strategy meetings that she used to find intellectually stimulating and feel like she was watching herself from outside her body, going through the motions of someone else's life. Sarah scheduled a session with her company's executive coach. "I think I need better work-life balance," she explained, assuming that the solution was optimization rather than recognition, that her soul was withdrawing its energy from a life that had become completely disconnected from her authentic nature. The coach recommended time management techniques and stress reduction strategies. Sarah implemented them all. She meditated for 10 minutes each morning using a popular app. She started taking yoga classes twice a week. She hired a meal prep service and upgraded to a more expensive gym, but the numbness persisted. If anything, it got worse. Then came the phantom anxiety. Sarah would be sitting in her office handling routine tasks when suddenly she would feel like something terrible was about to happen. Her chest would tighten, her palms would sweat, and she would feel an overwhelming urge to flee. She made an appointment with her primary care physician, convinced she was developing a heart condition. The EKG was normal. Blood work came back clean. Her doctor suggested that she might be experiencing stress-related anxiety and prescribed a low-dose anti-anxiety medication. Sarah took the medication faithfully. The panic attacks decreased, but something else began to shift. She started to feel like a stranger in her own life. She would look in the bathroom mirror at work and not recognize the woman staring back at her. Not physically, she looked the same. But the person in the mirror felt like someone she had never met, someone playing the role of Sarah Chen, while the real Sarah watched from somewhere else entirely. Jung would have recognized this immediately as the third sign of soul release: identity confusion. The ego structure that Sarah had built her entire adult life around was beginning to dissolve, and she was getting glimpses of the authentic self that had been buried beneath years of successful performance. But Sarah had no framework for understanding what was happening. She scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist, worried that she might be developing a dissociative disorder or early onset dementia. The psychiatrist diagnosed her with adjustment disorder and recommended cognitive behavioral therapy. Sarah added weekly therapy sessions to her already packed schedule, spending 50 minutes each week trying to figure out how to feel more like herself again. But the process escalated anyway. Her marriage, which had been unstable for 15 years, began to feel like a business partnership between two people who had forgotten why they had chosen each other. She and Michael still functioned well together. They managed their schedules efficiently, made financial decisions rationally, and presented a united front in parenting their children. But Sarah began to feel like she was married to a stranger, or perhaps like she was a stranger married to someone she used to know. Their conversations felt scripted. Their physical intimacy felt performative. Even their arguments felt like they were happening between two actors who had been playing the same roles for so long they had forgotten their real names. Jung would have called this the fourth sign: relationship mirrors. When the soul begins its release process, other people unconsciously begin to respond to the authentic self that's emerging rather than the persona that's dissolving. What feels like sudden relationship problems is often other people sensing that you're no longer fully identified with the role you used to play in their lives. Sarah suggested couples counseling. She and Michael spent 6 months in weekly sessions trying to recapture the connection they used to share. But the more they worked on their relationship, the more Sarah felt like she was trying to force herself back into a costume that no longer fit. Then the synchronicities started. Sarah began noticing meaningful coincidences everywhere. She would be thinking about her college roommate who had dropped out of law school to become a wildlife photographer and then receive a Facebook notification about that friend's latest project, documenting endangered species in Costa Rica. She would have a fleeting thought about what it would be like to work for a nonprofit organization, and then overhear a conversation about someone who had left corporate consulting to start a social enterprise focused on clean water access in developing countries. She would wonder what it would feel like to live somewhere other than Manhattan, and then notice real estate listings for farmhouses in Vermont appearing in her social media feed, even though she had never searched for rural properties. Jung called these experiences synchronicity storms, the fifth sign of soul release. When the authentic self begins to emerge from beneath layers of false identity, it starts to magnetize people, opportunities, and experiences that align with its true nature, even when the ego consciousness isn't yet ready to acknowledge these new directions. But Sarah interpreted these coincidences as distractions. She was already dealing with anxiety, depression, and relationship challenges. The last thing she needed was to start fantasizing about alternative life paths that had nothing to do with the responsibilities she had already committed to. She increased her meditation practice to 20 minutes twice daily and started taking a higher dose of anti-anxiety medication. She was determined to get her life back under control. That's when her body began its final rebellion. Sarah developed what her doctor initially diagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome. She would wake up after 8 hours of sleep feeling like she had been awake for days. Simple tasks that used to be automatic, responding to emails, preparing for meetings, making dinner for her family, began to require enormous amounts of energy. She consulted specialists. She had blood tests for autoimmune conditions, sleep studies for possible sleep apnea, and MRIs to rule out neurological issues. Every test came back normal, but her exhaustion persisted. What Sarah didn't understand was that she was experiencing the sixth sign of soul release, the body's rebellion against continuing patterns that the authentic self has already outgrown. Her fatigue wasn't a medical condition. It was her soul's way of preventing her from continuing to invest her life energy in an existence that had become completely divorced from her true nature. The breaking point came on that Tuesday morning in March, when Sarah found herself unable to enter her office building. She sat in her car for 2 hours, crying and calling in sick for the first time in 5 years. That afternoon, she made an appointment with a Jungian analyst she found through a Google search for Existential Therapy, New York City. She had no idea what Jungian analysis was, but something about the phrase individuation process in the therapist's description resonated with her in a way that previous therapeutic approaches had not. Dr. Elena Rodriguez listened to Sarah's story without immediately offering solutions or diagnoses. Instead, she asked a question that no one had asked before. What if none of this is pathological? What if your psyche is trying to communicate something important about who you're meant to become? For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt like someone was speaking her language. Dr. Rodriguez introduced Sarah to Jung's concept of the soul release process. She explained how the unconscious systematically dismantles external identities that have become too small for the expanding self. She helped Sarah recognize that her symptoms weren't signs that something was wrong with her. They were signs that something was finally going right. Your soul isn't trying to destroy your life, Dr. Rodriguez explained during their third session. It's trying to save you from a life that has become unconscious, mechanical, and disconnected from who you actually are. Sarah began to understand that her numbness wasn't depression. It was her authentic self withdrawing its energy from investments that no longer served her growth. Her anxiety wasn't a disorder. It was her soul's wisdom trying to prevent her from continuing patterns that were suffocating her true nature. Her identity confusion wasn't psychological illness. It was the first glimpse she had gotten in years of who she was, beyond her professional role and social status. The process wasn't easy. Sarah spent 6 months on medical leave, using that time to engage in active imagination dialogues with the part of herself that wanted to release her identification with corporate success. She discovered that beneath her executive persona was an artist, a nature lover, and someone deeply committed to environmental justice. She realized that her synchronicity storms weren't random coincidences. They were her unconscious mind pointing toward a life path that would integrate her professional skills with her authentic values and creative nature. 18 months after that morning in the parking garage, Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She resigned from her corporate position and accepted a role as executive director of a nonprofit organization focused on sustainable business practices. The salary was less than half of what she had earned before. She and Michael sold their Manhattan apartment and bought a house in Hudson Valley with enough land for a garden. Their children adjusted to public school and spending weekends hiking instead of shopping. Most of her former colleagues thought she had experienced some kind of midlife crisis or nervous breakdown. They couldn't understand why someone would voluntarily leave a successful career for uncertainty and financial insecurity. But Sarah understood something they didn't. She hadn't left success behind. She had finally discovered what success looked like when it was defined by alignment with authentic purpose rather than external achievement. 2 years later, her nonprofit had expanded to work with Fortune 500 companies on integrating environmental sustainability into their core business strategies. She was making a bigger impact on issues she cared about than she ever had in her previous role, and she was doing it from a place of authentic engagement rather than unconscious performance. Her marriage transformed as well. When Sarah stopped trying to be the wife she thought she was supposed to be and started being the woman she actually was, Michael fell in love with her all over again. Their relationship became more honest, more passionate, and more genuinely supportive. Jung would have called Sarah's transformation a successful individuation process, the conscious collaboration with the soul's release of what no longer serves in order to make space for authentic becoming. But the key insight from Sarah's story is this: her soul wasn't trying to punish her or break her down. It was trying to liberate her from a prison of success that had become indistinguishable from a beautiful cage. Every symptom, every challenge, every moment of confusion was her psyche's way of saying, "This life is too small for who you're meant to become. Let me show you what's possible when you stop trying to be who you think you should be and start being who you actually are." The question isn't whether your soul will begin this process if you've outgrown your current life structure. The question is whether you'll recognize what's happening when it does, and whether you'll have the courage to collaborate with your transformation instead of fighting against it. Jung's observations about the soul release process, made over a century ago through careful analysis of dreams, active imagination, and clinical observation, are now being validated by cutting-edge neuroscience research that reveals exactly how the brain reorganizes itself during major life transitions and identity shifts. What Jung called the transcendent function has a neurobiological foundation that modern science is just beginning to understand. Dr. Judson Brewer's groundbreaking research at Yale and Brown universities has identified specific neural networks that activate during what he calls letting go processes. Using functional MRI technology, Brewer has mapped how the brain literally rewires itself when individuals release old patterns of identity and behavior. The key discovery: the default mode network, a collection of brain regions active during rest and introspection, undergoes dramatic reorganization when people experience major life transitions that require letting go of previous self-concepts. The default mode network is essentially the neurological seat of what Jung called the ego, the collection of thoughts, memories, and identifications that create our sense of continuous self. When this network is overly active or rigidly structured, individuals experience what psychologists call rumination, and what Jung would have recognized as psychological possession by fixed identity patterns. But Brewer's research shows that during periods of conscious letting go, whether through meditation, therapy, or what Jung would call individuation work, the default mode network begins to function more flexibly. Old neural pathways associated with limiting self-concepts literally dissolve, while new connections form between previously disconnected brain regions. This neuroplasticity process explains why the soul release process often feels like psychological death before it feels like rebirth. The brain is actually dismantling neural structures associated with old identities and building new networks capable of supporting more complex and authentic ways of being. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on constructed emotion at Northeastern University provides another crucial piece of the puzzle. Barrett has demonstrated that what we experience as emotions aren't hardwired reactions, but rather constructions created by the brain based on past experience, current context, and future predictions. This has profound implications for understanding what Jung called the emotional symptoms of soul release, the anxiety, depression, and existential confusion that often accompany major identity transitions. Barrett's work suggests that these emotional states aren't pathological responses to external circumstances, but rather the brain's natural process of deconstructing old emotional patterns and constructing new ones more aligned with emerging identity structures. When someone like Sarah Chen experiences phantom anxiety during routine work activities, her brain isn't malfunctioning. It's recognizing that old neural patterns associated with professional identity no longer match her evolving sense of self, and it's generating emotional signals to draw her attention to this misalignment. The anxiety isn't the problem, it's the solution. It's her nervous system's way of saying, these patterns don't fit anymore. Something needs to change. Harvard Medical School's research on neuroplasticity during major life transitions has identified what researchers call neural reorganization periods, windows of time when the brain becomes especially malleable and capable of forming new connections. These periods typically occur during major life changes, career transitions, relationship changes, geographic moves, health crises, or what Jung would call individuation crises. During these windows, the brain's capacity for learning, adaptation, and identity reformation increases dramatically. But here's the crucial finding: the degree of positive transformation that occurs during these periods depends entirely on how consciously individuals engage with the process. People who try to suppress the discomfort of neural reorganization through medication, distraction, or forcing themselves back into old patterns often experience what researchers call incomplete transitions. They remain psychologically stuck between old and new identity structures, experiencing chronic anxiety, depression, and a sense of living in limbo. But individuals who learn to work consciously with neural reorganization through therapy, mindfulness practices, creative expression, or what Jung called active imagination, experience what researchers term post-traumatic growth, enhanced creativity, deeper relationships, greater resilience, and more authentic sense of purpose. This research validates Jung's central insight. The soul release process isn't pathological. It's the psyche's natural mechanism for evolution and growth. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's research on psychedelic therapy at Imperial College London has provided perhaps the most dramatic neurological evidence for Jung's theories about consciousness transformation. Using brain imaging technology, Carhart Harris has shown that psychedelics temporarily dissolve the default mode network's rigid patterns, creating what he calls neural entropy, a state of increased connectivity between brain regions that are normally separate. Participants in these studies report experiences remarkably similar to what Jung described during his own soul release process: dissolution of ego boundaries, encounters with archetypal figures, and profound shifts in identity and worldview. But what's most significant is that these neural changes persist long after the acute effects of the psychedelics have worn off. Brain scans show lasting increases in neural connectivity, enhanced communication between the emotional and rational centers of the brain, and greater flexibility in the default mode network. Participants report lasting improvements in depression, anxiety, and overall life satisfaction, but more importantly, they describe a fundamental shift in how they understand themselves and their place in the world. This research suggests that what Jung called individuation isn't just a psychological theory, it's a description of how consciousness naturally evolves when the brain is allowed to reorganize itself beyond the constraints of fixed identity patterns. Dr. Michael Mithoefer's research on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for trauma has revealed another crucial aspect of the soul release process: the role of emotional integration in identity transformation. Mithoefer's studies show that when individuals feel safe enough to experience and integrate previously suppressed emotions, the brain literally rewires itself to support greater emotional regulation and self-compassion. This validates Jung's observation that soul release often requires confronting what he called the shadow, the rejected aspects of ourselves that we've buried in the unconscious because they didn't fit our self-image or social expectations. The neuroscience shows that emotional suppression creates rigid neural patterns that limit the brain's capacity for adaptation and growth. But when individuals learn to consciously engage with suppressed emotions through therapy, creative expression, or other forms of inner work, the brain develops new neural pathways that support greater psychological flexibility and resilience. Dr. Matthew Lieberman's research on social neuroscience at UCLA has identified how the brain processes identity changes in relationship to others. His work shows that major identity shifts often require what he calls neural decoupling from social expectations and external validation systems. This explains why the soul release process often involves relationship challenges or social isolation. The brain is literally rewiring itself to function from internal rather than external reference points, which can temporarily disrupt social connections that were based on old identity patterns. But individuals who successfully navigate this process develop what Lieberman calls intrinsic motivation networks, neural patterns that support authentic self-expression and purpose-driven behavior rather than approval-seeking and role-playing. Research on the neuroscience of creativity has revealed another crucial aspect of soul release: the connection between identity dissolution and creative breakthrough. Dr. Arne Dietrich's work on transient hypofrontality shows that creative insights often occur when the prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with conscious control and self-censorship, temporarily reduces its activity, allowing for novel connections between previously unrelated ideas and experiences. This neurological process is remarkably similar to what Jung described as the dissolution of ego control that allows the self to emerge with new creative solutions and life directions. Many artists, writers, and inventors report that their most significant creative breakthroughs occurred during periods of personal crisis or identity confusion, exactly the conditions that Jung identified as characteristic of soul release. The neuroscience suggests that what feels like psychological breakdown might actually be the brain's natural process of clearing space for creative breakthrough. Dr. Wendy Suzuki's research on the neuroscience of life transitions has identified specific brain changes that occur during what she calls identity earthquakes, periods of major life change that require fundamental shifts in how we understand ourselves. Her studies show that these transitions activate the brain's neuroplasticity mechanisms, creating windows of opportunity for rapid learning, adaptation, and growth. But the key factor determining whether these transitions lead to positive transformation or psychological stuckness is the individual's willingness to engage consciously with the process of change. People who try to control or suppress the discomfort of identity transitions often develop what Suzuki calls neural rigidity, brain patterns that become increasingly inflexible and resistant to new information or experiences. But individuals who learn to tolerate the uncertainty and discomfort of identity transitions while remaining curious and open to new possibilities develop neural agility, brain patterns that support continued learning, adaptation, and authentic self-expression throughout life. This research provides a neurobiological foundation for Jung's emphasis on the importance of conscious engagement with the individuation process. The brain's capacity for transformation is enormous, but it requires conscious collaboration to reach its full potential. The implications of this research extend far beyond individual psychology. Studies of collective behavior and social change show that societies undergo similar processes of identity release and transformation during periods of cultural transition. Just as individuals must sometimes release outdated self-concepts to evolve, cultures must release outdated beliefs and structures to remain vital and adaptive. And just as individual transformation requires conscious engagement with the process of change, cultural transformation requires collective willingness to question assumptions and explore new possibilities. The neuroscience of soul release isn't just validating Jung's clinical observations. It's revealing that the capacity for conscious transformation is literally built into the structure of human consciousness. Your brain is designed to evolve, to release what no longer serves, and to reorganize itself around more authentic and complex ways of being. The question isn't whether you have the neurological capacity for transformation. The question is whether you'll create the conditions that allow that capacity to express itself. The research is clear. The soul release process that Jung identified through decades of clinical work is now understood as the brain's natural mechanism for psychological evolution. But it requires one crucial ingredient that no medication or technique can provide: your conscious willingness to collaborate with your own transformation. When you understand that the anxiety, confusion, and sense of identity dissolution that often accompany major life transitions aren't signs of mental illness, but rather evidence of your brain's sophisticated capacity for growth, everything changes. You stop fighting against the process and start learning how to work with it. You stop trying to return to old patterns that no longer fit and start creating space for new patterns that serve your authentic becoming. The neuroscience shows that your brain is far more capable of transformation than you've been taught to believe, but it's waiting for your permission to begin the process of releasing what no longer serves your highest potential. Jung spent decades documenting the specific ways the soul communicates its intention to release what no longer serves authentic becoming. Through careful observation of thousands of patients and his own psychological journey, he identified 6 distinct manifestations of this process, a typology that allows you to recognize when your deepest intelligence is trying to liberate you from unconscious imprisonment. These aren't random symptoms or unfortunate circumstances. They're precise communications from your authentic self, each addressing a different aspect of false identity that must be dissolved for genuine individuation to occur. Sign 1. The Great Disinterest. The first sign appears as a gradual or sudden withdrawal of life energy from activities, relationships, or goals that previously provided meaning and motivation. This isn't ordinary boredom or temporary burnout. It's the soul's systematic withdrawal of what Jung called libidinal investment from external structures that have become prisons rather than vehicles for growth. Maria, a 38-year-old physician, described it perfectly. I woke up one morning and realized I felt nothing about going to work. Not negative, not positive, just nothing. It was like someone had turned off a switch that had been powering my life for 15 years. The great disinterest often begins subtly. You notice that conversations about your career feel hollow. Goals that used to excite you now feel arbitrary or meaningless. Activities that once brought pleasure now require enormous effort to maintain enthusiasm. Most people interpret this as depression and seek medication or therapy to restore their previous level of engagement. But Jung understood that the great disinterest is actually the soul's wisdom, withdrawing energy from investments that no longer serve authentic development. Your unconscious has recognized that continuing to pour life energy into structures that have become too small for your expanding consciousness would be a form of spiritual suicide. The disinterest isn't pathological, it's protective. The key insight: the soul never withdraws interest from what genuinely serves your growth. It only releases what has shifted from vehicle to obstacle, from opportunity to imprisonment. Sign 2. The phantom anxiety. The second sign manifests as unexplained panic, restlessness, or sense of impending doom that has no apparent external cause. Unlike anxiety triggered by specific circumstances, phantom anxiety emerges from the unconscious depths when the gap between authentic self and performed identity becomes too wide to sustain. Jung observed that this anxiety isn't about anything in particular. It's about everything in general. It's the psyche's emergency signal that your current life structure has become fundamentally misaligned with your true nature. David, a successful marketing executive, experienced phantom anxiety as feeling like I was in constant danger, but I couldn't identify what the threat was. I would be sitting in meetings discussing campaigns I had designed, and suddenly feel like I needed to run for my life. The phantom anxiety often intensifies when you try to force yourself back into patterns that your authentic self has already outgrown. It's your soul's refusal to participate in continued unconscious living. Traditional anxiety management focuses on symptom reduction, but Jung's approach recognizes phantom anxiety as crucial information about misalignment between being and doing, between who you are and how you're living. The anxiety isn't the problem, it's pointing toward the problem. It's your deepest intelligence trying to prevent you from continuing to invest your life in structures that have become threats to your authentic becoming. Sign 3. The identity confusion. The third sign appears as questioning fundamental beliefs about yourself, experiencing periods where you don't recognize the person in the mirror, or feeling like you're acting in someone else's life rather than living your own. This isn't ordinary self-reflection or healthy questioning of assumptions. This is the systematic dissolution of ego structures that have been mistaken for your actual identity, creating temporary confusion as the authentic self begins to emerge from beneath layers of conditioning and performance. Jennifer, a 45-year-old attorney, described it as looking in the mirror and thinking, "Who is this person?" Not physically, I looked the same, but the woman staring back at me felt like a complete stranger, like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in decades, and I had no idea who I actually was. The identity confusion often includes periods of not knowing what you want, what you believe, or what feels true for you. Values that previously seemed clear become questionable. Preferences that felt stable begin to shift. The solid sense of self that you've relied on for years suddenly feels arbitrary or constructed. Most people find this experience terrifying and seek therapy to restore their previous sense of identity. But Jung understood that identity confusion is actually the beginning of authentic self-discovery, the dissolution of false identity making space for genuine self-knowledge to emerge. The confusion isn't pathological, it's the natural result of recognizing that much of what you thought was you was actually a collection of roles, expectations, and survival strategies that were never meant to define your essential being. Sign 4. The relationship mirrors. The fourth sign manifests as conflicts or distance appearing in previously stable relationships, as if other people suddenly see through the persona you've constructed and respond to the authentic self that's trying to emerge. Jung called this phenomenon relationship mirroring because other people unconsciously begin to reflect back the changes happening in your psychological depths, often before you're consciously aware of them yourself. Relationships that were based on shared roles, mutual performance, or unconscious contracts suddenly feel strained or artificial. Partners, friends, or colleagues begin responding to you differently, as if they sense that the person they thought they knew is no longer fully present. Rachel, a 41-year-old mother, noticed that my husband kept asking if I was okay, but I felt fine. My friends seemed distant even though I hadn't done anything differently. It was like everyone was responding to some version of me that I couldn't see yet. The relationship mirrors often trigger attempts to fix or improve relationships through couples therapy, better communication, or increased effort to maintain previous patterns of connection. But Jung understood that these relationship shifts are often reflecting internal transformation rather than external problems. People are unconsciously responding to your emerging authenticity, even when your conscious mind hasn't yet recognized the changes occurring in your psychological depths. The relationship challenges aren't obstacles to overcome. They're information about the identity transformation happening within you. Sign 5. The synchronicity storms. The fifth sign appears as unusual coincidences, meaningful accidents, or seemingly random events that point toward new directions despite your conscious resistance to change. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that seem to carry messages from the unconscious about directions for growth and development. During soul release periods, these synchronicities often intensify into what he called synchronicity storms, clusters of meaningful coincidences that seem to be orchestrating circumstances toward transformation. Michael, a 52-year-old banker, experienced synchronicity storms as the universe conspiring to get my attention I would think about my college friend who became a teacher and then receive a LinkedIn message from someone starting an educational nonprofit. I would wonder about living somewhere other than the city and then notice real estate ads for rural properties everywhere I looked. The synchronicity storms often present opportunities, connections, or information related to life paths that align with your authentic nature, but contradict your conscious plans or expectations. They appear to be random coincidences, but their timing and relevance suggest some form of unconscious orchestration. Most people dismiss synchronicities as coincidental or interpret them as distractions from their real responsibilities. But Jung understood that synchronicity storms are the unconscious mind's way of drawing attention to possibilities that the ego hasn't yet considered, but that align with the soul's intention for authentic development. The synchronicities aren't random. They're the psyche's way of magnetizing circumstances that support your authentic becoming, even when your conscious mind isn't yet ready to acknowledge these new directions. Sign 6, the body's rebellion. The sixth sign manifests as unexplained health issues, changes in sleep patterns, or physical symptoms that appear when you try to force yourself back into old patterns that your authentic self has outgrown. Jung observed that the body often becomes the final messenger when psychological communications have been ignored or suppressed. Physical symptoms that have no clear medical cause frequently represent the body's refusal to support continued living patterns that have become misaligned with authentic being. The body's rebellion can include mysterious fatigue that appears specifically when engaging in activities that no longer serve your growth. Insomnia that coincides with attempts to return to previous routines, or physical symptoms that disappear when you align your actions with your authentic nature. Lisa, a 39-year-old consultant, experienced body rebellion as chronic exhaustion that only appeared when I tried to work on projects that used to energize me. Medical tests showed nothing wrong, but I would feel completely drained after client meetings that previously excited me. Traditional medicine often treats these symptoms as stress-related disorders, but Jung's approach recognizes the body's wisdom in refusing to support psychological patterns that have become threats to authentic development. The body isn't malfunctioning, it's communicating. It's your soul's way of preventing you from continuing to invest your life energy in structures that have become prisons rather than vehicles for growth. Understanding the pattern. These 6 signs rarely appear in isolation. Most people experiencing soul release encounter multiple signs simultaneously, creating what Jung called a constellation of symptoms that point toward the same underlying process, the systematic dismantling of false identity to make space for authentic becoming. The key to working with these signs is recognition rather than resistance. Instead of treating each sign as a problem to be solved, Jung's approach involves learning to interpret them as communications from your deepest intelligence about what needs to be released and what wants to be born. Each sign represents a different aspect of false identity being dissolved. The great disinterest releases identification with external achievements and roles. The phantom anxiety signals misalignment between being and performing. The identity confusion dissolves rigid self-concepts and opens space for self-discovery. The relationship mirrors reflect internal changes through external feedback. The synchronicity storms magnetize circumstances aligned with authentic development. The body's rebellion prevents continued investment in misaligned patterns. Together, these 6 signs create a comprehensive system for liberation from unconscious living. They're not symptoms of pathology, they're evidence of your psyche's sophisticated intelligence working to free you from a life that has become too small for who you're meant to become. The question isn't whether you'll experience these signs if you're committed to authentic growth. Jung argued that they're inevitable for anyone seeking genuine individuation. The question is whether you'll recognize them as communications rather than problems, whether you'll learn to collaborate with the process rather than fight against it, and whether you'll have the courage to trust your soul's intelligence to guide you toward the life you came here to live. Which of these signs do you recognize in your own experience? The soul's liberation process is unique for each individual, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Your deepest intelligence working to free you from everything that prevents you from becoming who you actually are. Jung documented 5 progressive dangers that occur when individuals fight against their soul's natural release process, creating what he called the provisional life, a state of perpetual preparation for authentic existence that never arrives because they're too terrified to let go of their psychological prison. These dangers aren't theoretical possibilities. They're predictable stages of deterioration that Jung observed in patients who persistently refuse to collaborate with their own transformation. Understanding these escalating risks is crucial because each stage makes the next more likely, creating a downward spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Danger 1. Psychological petrification. The first danger appears as increasing rigidity, defensiveness, and inability to adapt to life's natural changes. When you fight against the soul's release process, you unconsciously invest enormous energy in maintaining structures that have already outlived their usefulness. Jung called this psychological petrification, a gradual hardening of personality patterns that transforms living consciousness into something resembling stone. You become a monument to who you used to be, rather than a living expression of who you're becoming. Robert, a 55-year-old insurance executive, exemplified this process when his soul began sending signals that his career no longer aligned with his values. He responded by working longer hours and pursuing additional certifications. When relationships began reflecting his internal changes, he became more controlling and demanding. I felt like everyone around me was going crazy, Robert explained. My wife wanted to make changes I couldn't understand. My children seemed to be rejecting everything I had worked to provide them, and my colleagues were embracing new approaches that felt foreign to everything I had learned about business. But Robert wasn't surrounded by crazy people. He was surrounded by individuals who were naturally adapting and growing, while he remained frozen in patterns that had become too small for his expanding consciousness. Psychological petrification creates a kind of living death. You function, but you don't truly exist. You maintain appearances, but you lose contact with the creative, spontaneous, authentic aspects of yourself that make life worth living. The tragedy is that each day of petrification makes change more difficult. Neural pathways become increasingly rigid, relationships become more superficial, and the gap between your authentic self and your performed identity becomes so wide that bridging it feels impossible. Danger 2. Projection amplification. The second danger manifests as unconsciously blaming external circumstances or other people for internal conflicts, creating endless cycles of blame and victimhood that prevent any real resolution. When the soul begins its release process, you experience discomfort, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. But if you refuse to recognize these feelings as communications about needed internal changes, you unconsciously project responsibility onto external targets. Jung observed that projection amplification follows predictable patterns. First, you blame your job, then your relationships, then society, then fate itself. Each projection temporarily relieves the pressure of taking responsibility for your own transformation, but it also makes you increasingly powerless to create meaningful change. Sandra, a 43-year-old marketing manager, demonstrated this progression. When her soul began withdrawing energy from her career, she blamed her boss for being unsupportive. When that didn't resolve her dissatisfaction, she blamed her husband for not encouraging her enough. When relationship counseling failed to restore her sense of purpose, she blamed society for not valuing creativity. Everyone around me was holding me back, Sandra explained. If I had a different boss, a more supportive partner, or lived in a more progressive community, I would be able to pursue my real passions. But Sandra's problem wasn't external circumstances. It was her refusal to take responsibility for making the internal changes that would align her external life with her authentic values and interests. Projection amplification creates a victim mentality that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Each external target that fails to solve your internal conflicts proves that you're powerless, trapped, and at the mercy of forces beyond your control. The irony is that the very dissatisfaction you're projecting onto others is actually your soul's way of empowering you to create the changes needed for authentic growth. But projection transforms empowerment into victimhood, wisdom into blame, and opportunity into resentment. Danger. 3. Shadow possession. The third danger occurs when rejected aspects of yourself begin to control your behavior unconsciously, leading to actions that contradict your conscious values and creating what Jung called shadow possession. Every identity structure requires rejecting certain aspects of human nature that don't fit the image you're trying to maintain. These rejected aspects don't disappear. They accumulate in what Jung called the shadow, the repository of disowned parts of yourself. During soul release, these shadow aspects often try to emerge and be integrated into conscious awareness. But if you refuse this integration process, fighting to maintain your previous identity structure, the shadow can begin to possess your behavior unconsciously. Mark, a 47-year-old minister, had built his identity around being patient, compassionate, and spiritually wise. But when his soul began releasing his identification with perfect righteousness, shadow aspects like anger, doubt, and sexuality began demanding attention. Instead of consciously integrating these aspects into a more complete and authentic sense of self, Mark fought against them, increasing his spiritual practices and doubling down on his identity as someone who had transcended such lower impulses. But the shadow doesn't go away when ignored. It goes underground. Mark began experiencing unexpected outbursts of rage during sermons, developing compulsive sexual fantasies and feeling overwhelmed by cynicism about religious institutions. I felt like I was being attacked by demonic forces, Mark explained. The more I prayed and tried to purify myself, the worse these thoughts and impulses became. But Mark wasn't being attacked by external forces. He was being possessed by aspects of himself that he had rejected so completely that they had become autonomous and destructive. Shadow possession creates what Jung called the return of the repressed, disowned aspects of yourself that emerge in distorted, compulsive, or destructive forms precisely because they've been denied conscious integration. The solution isn't stronger defenses against the shadow. It's conscious dialogue and integration. But this requires admitting that your previous self-image was incomplete, which can feel like psychological death to someone who has identified completely with a particular role or identity. Danger 4. Neurotic. Compromise. The fourth danger appears as developing symptoms, addictions, or compulsive behaviors as the psyche attempts to manage the tension between who you are and who you think you should be. When you refuse to release what no longer serves while simultaneously being unable to suppress your authentic nature completely, the psyche creates compromise formations, symptoms that partially express your authentic needs while maintaining the illusion of psychological stability. Jung observed that many psychological symptoms aren't signs of mental illness, but rather creative compromises that allow individuals to express their authentic nature indirectly while avoiding the terror of conscious transformation. Patricia, a 41-year-old accountant, developed what her doctor diagnosed as chronic fatigue syndrome precisely when her soul began trying to redirect her energy toward creative pursuits. The fatigue made it impossible for her to maintain her previous level of professional performance, but it also provided a socially acceptable excuse for not pursuing the artistic interests that terrified her ego. "I wanted to paint and write poetry," Patricia explained, "but those weren't practical or responsible. The fatigue gave me permission to rest, but it also prevented me from having energy for creativity. It was like my psyche found a way to partially honor my authentic needs without requiring me to make scary changes." Neurotic compromise creates symptoms that serve multiple unconscious purposes. They express authentic needs indirectly. They punish you for not making conscious changes, and they provide excuses for avoiding the risks of authentic transformation. But compromise formations are exhausting to maintain and become increasingly elaborate over time. What starts as occasional anxiety or mild depression can evolve into complex symptom patterns that dominate your entire life. The tragedy is that the energy required to maintain neurotic compromise could be used for conscious transformation. But compromise feels safer than change, even when it creates more suffering than growth would require. Danger. 5. Existential death. The fifth and most serious danger is reaching a point where life feels meaningless, empty, or purposeless because you've successfully defended yourself against the soul's transformative process. Jung called this existential death, a state where you're biologically alive but psychologically dead, where you continue to function but have lost contact with anything that makes existence feel worth living. Existential death occurs when you've succeeded in suppressing all communications from your authentic self for so long that you no longer remember who you actually are beneath the roles you perform. You achieve the psychological stability you thought you wanted, but at the cost of everything that makes life meaningful. Thomas, a 62-year-old attorney, described existential death as waking up one day and realizing I felt nothing about anything. Not sad, not angry, not disappointed, just nothing. I had achieved everything I thought I wanted, but it felt like I was watching someone else's life from behind glass. Thomas had successfully resisted multiple soul release processes over 2 decades. He had medicated away anxiety, forced himself through periods of disinterest, and rebuilt his identity each time it began to dissolve. He had achieved perfect psychological stability, but in the process he had lost contact with his authentic self so completely that he could no longer access genuine emotion, spontaneous creativity, or natural enthusiasm for anything. Existential death is the ultimate price of refusing transformation. You avoid the risks and uncertainty of growth, but you also lose access to everything that makes human existence meaningful: passion, purpose, love, creativity, and connection to something larger than your ego concerns. The most tragic aspect of existential death is that it often appears from the outside, like success. Thomas had a prestigious career, financial security, and social respect, but he had purchased this stability by sacrificing his soul. The accelerating pattern. These 5 dangers don't occur in isolation. They tend to accelerate each other in a downward spiral. Psychological petrification makes you more likely to project blame onto others. Projection amplification increases shadow possession. Shadow possession creates neurotic compromise, and prolonged neurotic compromise leads ultimately to existential death. Each stage makes the next more probable and more difficult to reverse. The longer you resist the soul's release process, the more energy you must invest in maintaining psychological defenses that become increasingly elaborate and exhausting. But Jung emphasized that it's never too late for conscious transformation. Even individuals who have reached the stage of existential death can begin the process of soul release if they're willing to acknowledge that their psychological stability has been purchased at too high a cost. The key is recognizing that what feels like psychological death, the dissolution of familiar identity structures, is actually the prerequisite for psychological birth. You can't become who you're meant to be while clinging to who you think you are. The soul release process isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to save you from the progressive deterioration that occurs when you refuse to grow. The apparent death of old identity structures is the price of admission to authentic life. But the choice is yours. You can collaborate with your own transformation, or you can resist until the cost of resistance exceeds the terror of change. Jung's clinical experience showed that most people wait until they reach the later stages of deterioration before becoming willing to engage consciously with transformation. But every day of delay makes the process more difficult and the outcome less certain. The soul's release process is offering you the opportunity to die to what you're not, so you can be born into who you actually are. The question is whether you'll accept this invitation voluntarily, or whether you'll wait until the pain of staying the same exceeds the fear of changing. Jung didn't just identify the problem of soul possession and the dangers of resisting transformation. He developed a systematic approach to working with the soul's release process rather than against it. He called this approach individuation, and it represents one of humanity's most sophisticated methodologies for conscious psychological evolution. The individuation blueprint isn't a quick fix or a simple technique. It's a comprehensive framework for collaborating with your soul's intelligence to release what no longer serves while integrating what wants to emerge. Jung developed this approach through decades of clinical work, extensive study of world religions and mythologies, and his own 6-year journey through what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. Step 1. Conscious recognition. The individuation process begins with learning to recognize the signs of soul release as natural psychological processes rather than pathological symptoms. This requires what Jung called a fundamental shift in attitude, moving from resistance to curiosity, from pathologizing to understanding. Most people experiencing soul release have been conditioned to interpret discomfort, uncertainty, and change as problems to be solved rather than communications to be understood. The first step in individuation is developing what Jung called symbolic attitude, the ability to see symptoms as meaningful messages rather than random misfortunes. Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, described this shift. Instead of asking, "How can I get rid of this anxiety?" the individual learns to ask, "What is this anxiety trying to communicate about my current life situation?" This doesn't mean passively accepting suffering or avoiding practical solutions to real problems. It means developing the capacity to distinguish between symptoms that point toward needed changes and symptoms that require medical intervention, between psychological communications and biological dysfunctions. Sarah, the executive we met earlier, exemplified this shift. Instead of trying to eliminate her panic attacks, she began asking what they were trying to tell her about her relationship to work and success. Instead of fighting her loss of interest in her career, she explored what this disinterest might reveal about her authentic values and aspirations. Conscious recognition also involves understanding the difference between ego and self, between the collection of roles, achievements, and identifications that create your social personality and the deeper center of authentic being that Jung called the self with a capital S. The ego isn't the enemy in Jung's system. It's a necessary structure for functioning in the world. But problems arise when the ego becomes inflated, believing that it is the totality of who you are rather than one important but limited aspect of your complete being. Individuation requires what Jung called ego-self collaboration, a conscious partnership between the practical, adaptive aspects of personality and the deeper wisdom of your authentic nature. Step 2. Active imagination. The second step involves engaging directly with the unconscious through what Jung called active imagination, a systematic method for dialoguing with the aspects of yourself that exist beyond conscious awareness. Active imagination isn't daydreaming or fantasy. It's a disciplined practice of allowing unconscious contents to emerge in symbolic form and then engaging with them consciously through dialogue, visualization, or creative expression. Jung discovered that the unconscious doesn't communicate through rational analysis. It speaks through images, symbols, emotions, and archetypal figures. Active imagination creates a bridge between conscious and unconscious awareness, allowing you to receive guidance from deeper levels of intelligence. The process begins by entering a relaxed meditative state and allowing images or impressions to arise spontaneously. Instead of analyzing or controlling these images, you engage with them as if they were independent beings with their own intelligence and purpose. Maria, a teacher going through soul release, practiced active imagination by dialoguing with an inner figure she called the woman in the forest, a symbolic representation of her connection to nature and creativity that had been suppressed during her years of urban teaching. Through regular conversations with this inner figure, Maria discovered that her soul wanted to release her identification with conventional classroom teaching and explore environmental education that combined her love of children with her passion for the natural world. Active imagination revealed possibilities that rational planning could never have uncovered because it accessed wisdom from beyond the limited perspective of ego consciousness. Jung emphasized that active imagination requires what he called holding the tension, remaining consciously present during the process, without either dismissing the images as meaningless or becoming completely identified with them as literal reality. The goal isn't to escape rational consciousness, but to expand it through conscious engagement with symbolic and intuitive dimensions of intelligence. Step 3. Shadow integration. The third step involves acknowledging and incorporating the rejected aspects of yourself that have been driving the need for false attachments and rigid identity structures. Jung observed that every conscious attitude creates its opposite in the unconscious. If you identify yourself as always patient, your shadow contains impatience. If you see yourself as completely rational, your shadow holds emotional and irrational impulses. If you define yourself through spiritual purity, your shadow contains earthly desires and human imperfections. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply the repository of all the human qualities that don't fit your conscious self-image. But when shadow aspects remain unconscious, they either possess your behavior in destructive ways or create internal conflicts that drain your energy and limit your authenticity. Shadow integration doesn't mean acting out every impulse or abandoning ethical standards. It means consciously acknowledging the full spectrum of human nature within yourself and finding healthy ways to express previously rejected aspects of your personality. Michael, a minister experiencing soul release, discovered that his shadow contained anger about religious hypocrisy, sexual desires that contradicted his spiritual image, and intellectual doubts about literal interpretations of Scripture. Instead of viewing these shadow elements as temptations to overcome, he learned to engage with them as sources of authenticity and wisdom. Through shadow integration, Michael's ministry became more honest, more compassionate, and more effective. He could connect with parishioners' struggles because he had acknowledged similar struggles within himself. His spiritual teaching became more nuanced and psychologically sophisticated because he had integrated rather than rejected the complexity of human nature. Jung discovered that what people fear most about their shadow is usually what they most need to integrate for complete authentic development. The aspects of yourself that you judge most harshly often contain the keys to your greatest creative potential and deepest wisdom. Step 4. Persona flexibility. The fourth step involves developing the ability to wear different social masks consciously rather than being unconsciously identified with any single role or identity. Jung distinguished between healthy persona usage and persona identification. A flexible persona is like a tool. You can put it on when appropriate for specific situations and take it off when it's no longer needed. Persona identification occurs when you become so fused with a particular role that you forget there's someone underneath the mask. Individuation doesn't eliminate the need for personas. It creates conscious choice about how and when you use them. You learn to be a professional when professionalism serves your goals, a parent when parenting is called for, and a friend when friendship is appropriate, without losing contact with the authentic self that exists beyond any particular role. Jennifer, the attorney experiencing identity confusion, learned to distinguish between her professional persona and her essential identity. She could engage her attorney persona when legal work was required, but she no longer believed that attorney defined who she was as a complete human being. This persona flexibility allowed Jennifer to explore other aspects of herself: artist, nature, lover, spiritual seeker, without experiencing the identity crisis that occurs when someone is unconsciously identified with only one role. Jung emphasized that persona flexibility requires what he called conscious sacrifice, the willingness to periodically let go of familiar identities in order to discover new aspects of your authentic nature. Step 5. Anima-animus integration. The fifth step involves healing the relationship with your inner opposite gender archetype, what Jung called the anima in men and animus in women. This work reduces projections onto others and increases psychological wholeness. Jung observed that every individual contains both masculine and feminine psychological qualities regardless of biological gender. The anima represents the feminine aspects within men: emotional sensitivity, intuitive wisdom, receptivity, and creative imagination. The animus represents the masculine aspects within women: focused thinking, assertive action, logical analysis, and spiritual discrimination. When these inner opposite gender qualities remain unconscious, they often get projected onto romantic partners, creating relationships based on psychological completion rather than authentic love. You unconsciously seek partners who embody the qualities you haven't developed within yourself. Anima-animus integration involves developing a conscious relationship with these inner qualities so that you become more psychologically complete and less dependent on external relationships for wholeness. David, a businessman experiencing soul release, discovered that his anima contained artistic sensitivity, emotional intelligence, and spiritual intuition that he had rejected as unmasculine. By developing conscious relationship with these qualities through creative expression and inner dialogue, he became more complete and less dependent on his wife to provide all the emotional and aesthetic dimensions of his life. Similarly, Rachel, a mother going through individuation, learned to develop the animus qualities of clear thinking, assertive communication, and spiritual discrimination that she had projected onto male authority figures throughout her life. Anima-animus integration creates what Jung called the divine marriage within, a conscious union of masculine and feminine psychological principles that reduces dependency on others for completion and increases capacity for authentic relationship, based on wholeness rather than neediness. Step 6. Self-realization. The final step involves allowing a new center of personality to emerge that transcends but includes the ego's concerns. Jung called this deeper center the self, the archetype of wholeness that orchestrates psychological development throughout the lifespan. Self-realization doesn't mean ego elimination, it means ego transformation. The ego learns to serve the self's larger purposes, rather than defending its own narrow concerns. Decisions begin to flow from deeper wisdom rather than surface fears. Actions become expressions of authentic nature rather than reactions to external pressures. This transformation creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to synthesize opposite forces into new configurations of consciousness that serve both individual development and collective welfare. Thomas, a corporate executive who completed the individuation process, described self-realization. "I still do strategic planning and manage teams, but now these activities feel like expressions of something deeper rather than efforts to prove my worth or maintain my identity. Work became a vehicle for serving something larger than my ego concerns." Self-realization produces what Jung called the twice-born personality, someone who has died to unconscious living and been reborn into conscious authenticity. This isn't a mystical experience, but a practical transformation that affects every aspect of daily existence. The integration challenge. Jung emphasized that individuation isn't a linear progression through these steps, but rather a spiral process that revisits each element at deeper levels throughout life. You don't complete shadow integration once and never need to address it again. You continue discovering new shadow aspects as your consciousness expands. Similarly, you don't achieve self-realization and then live happily ever after. You learn to collaborate with the self's guidance while still managing practical responsibilities, maintaining relationships, and contributing to society. The individuation blueprint provides a framework for conscious transformation, but each person's journey is unique. What matters isn't following the steps perfectly, but developing the capacity to recognize when your soul is trying to release what no longer serves and responding with curiosity rather than resistance. Jung's solution transforms the soul release process from something that happens to you into something you actively participate in. Instead of being a victim of psychological forces beyond your control, you become a conscious collaborator in your own transformation. The individuation blueprint doesn't eliminate the challenges of growth and change. It provides tools for navigating those challenges consciously rather than unconsciously. It doesn't guarantee a life without difficulty, but it offers the possibility of finding meaning and purpose in difficulty. Most importantly, Jung's solution recognizes that the soul release process isn't pathological, it's teleological. It's oriented toward a goal, the emergence of your most authentic, creative, and complete self. The question isn't whether you'll experience soul release if you're committed to growth. The question is whether you'll use Jung's blueprint to collaborate consciously with the process, or whether you'll continue fighting against the very forces that are trying to liberate you from unconscious imprisonment. Jung documented numerous cases throughout his career that illustrate the dramatic difference between resisting and embracing the soul's release process. These historical contrasts reveal that the same psychological forces that lead to breakdown when resisted can produce breakthrough when consciously engaged. The pattern remains consistent across cultures, centuries, and circumstances. Those who fight against soul release may maintain external stability temporarily, but they lose vitality, creativity, and authentic connection to life. Those who learn to collaborate with the process often face temporary chaos, but emerge more integrated, purposeful, and genuinely alive. Failure case: the minister's spiritual collapse. Reverend William Harrison exemplified the catastrophic consequences of resisting soul release. At age 45, after 20 years of successful ministry, Harrison began experiencing what Jung would have immediately recognized as classic signs of individuation crisis. The great disinterest manifested as growing numbness during sermons that used to inspire him. The phantom anxiety appeared as panic attacks during prayer and scripture reading. Identity confusion emerged as questioning fundamental beliefs about literal interpretations of biblical stories. But instead of recognizing these experiences as his soul's attempt to evolve his spiritual understanding beyond rigid dogma, Harrison interpreted them as demonic attacks on his faith. He increased his prayer time, fasted more frequently, and sought counsel from conservative religious authorities who confirmed his interpretation. "The devil is trying to destroy my ministry," Harrison confided to Jung during their sessions. "These doubts and anxieties are tests of my faith that I must overcome through spiritual discipline and submission to God's will." Jung recognized that Harrison's soul was trying to release his identification with religious certainty to make space for a more mature, psychologically sophisticated spirituality. The doubts weren't attacks on faith. They were invitations to a deeper, more authentic relationship with the divine that could include mystery, paradox, and psychological complexity. But Harrison fought against this evolution with increasing desperation. He preached more forcefully about the dangers of questioning religious authority. He denounced modern psychology as incompatible with Christian faith. He isolated himself from colleagues who expressed any theological uncertainty or intellectual curiosity. The shadow possession began subtly. Despite his conscious commitment to love and compassion, Harrison became increasingly judgmental and harsh in his personal relationships. He experienced uncontrollable rage toward parishioners who asked complex theological questions. He developed compulsive sexual fantasies that tormented him with guilt and shame. "I feel like I'm being invaded by forces I don't understand," Harrison explained. "The more I pray and study scripture, the worse these thoughts become. I must be losing my mind or my faith." But Harrison wasn't losing his mind. He was losing his rigidly constructed religious persona. The aspects of human nature he had rejected in his pursuit of spiritual purity were emerging from the shadow in distorted, compulsive forms because they had been denied conscious integration. The breaking point came during Harrison's Christmas Eve sermon. While preaching about divine love, he experienced a complete psychological breakdown in front of his congregation. He began screaming about hypocrisy, doubt, and the impossibility of believing in a God who allowed suffering. The congregation was traumatized. Church leadership immediately placed Harrison on indefinite leave. His wife, unable to understand what had happened to the man she married, filed for divorce. His children, embarrassed by their father's public collapse, refused to maintain contact. Harrison spent the next 5 years in and out of psychiatric hospitals, diagnosed with bipolar disorder and treated with medication that suppressed his symptoms but provided no real healing. He never returned to ministry, never reconciled with his family, and never found a way to integrate his spiritual crisis into a more mature faith. Jung's final notes about Harrison reveal the tragedy. The soul was offering him the opportunity to become a more complete minister, one who could speak to both the heights and depths of human experience. But his refusal to release his identification with spiritual perfection turned potential breakthrough into permanent breakdown. Success case: the artist's authentic renaissance. In contrast, consider Elena Vasquez, a 38-year-old commercial artist who faced remarkably similar soul release pressures but chose conscious collaboration over unconscious resistance. Elena had built a successful career creating advertising campaigns for major corporations. She earned excellent money, lived in a prestigious neighborhood, and was respected by colleagues for her technical skills and professional reliability. But at age 38, the same 6 signs that had challenged Reverend Harrison began appearing in Elena's life. She lost interest in commercial work that had previously motivated her. She experienced anxiety when meeting with corporate clients. She began questioning her identity as someone who created art to sell products rather than express truth. The crucial difference was Elena's response to these experiences. Instead of interpreting them as problems to be solved, she recognized them as communications from her deeper self about needed changes in her life direction. "I felt like my soul was trying to tell me something important," Elena explained to Jung during their work together. "Instead of fighting against these feelings, I became curious about what they might mean." Elena began practicing active imagination, dialoguing with the part of herself that was losing interest in commercial art. Through these inner conversations, she discovered that her authentic artistic vision involved social justice themes and environmental activism, subjects that had no place in corporate advertising. But instead of immediately quitting her job and pursuing fine art, Elena approached the transition consciously and gradually. She began taking on pro bono projects for environmental nonprofits during weekends. She started creating personal artwork that explored themes of social responsibility and ecological awareness. As her authentic artistic vision became clearer, Elena made strategic decisions about transitioning her career. She saved money for a year while building a portfolio of socially conscious work. She cultivated relationships with galleries and organizations that aligned with her values. She prepared financially and emotionally for the uncertainty of leaving commercial success for authentic expression. The shadow work was challenging but transformative. Elena discovered that her shadow contained fierce anger about environmental destruction and social inequality, emotions she had suppressed because they didn't fit her professional image as someone who helped corporations sell products. Instead of being possessed by this shadow anger, Elena learned to channel it consciously into her artistic work. Her paintings became powerful expressions of environmental advocacy. Her installations challenged viewers to examine their relationship with consumption and waste. The relationship mirrors were initially difficult. Some friends and colleagues couldn't understand why Elena would leave financial security for uncertain artistic pursuits. Her family worried that she was having a midlife crisis or mental breakdown, but Elena held steady to her authentic path, while remaining compassionate toward others' concerns. She explained her decisions clearly, maintained her relationships where possible, and accepted that some connections might need to evolve or end as she became more authentic. The synchronicity storms provided confirmation and support. Elena began encountering opportunities, collaborators, and resources that aligned perfectly with her new direction. Gallery owners approached her about exhibitions. Environmental organizations invited her to create installations for awareness campaigns. Fellow artists interested in social justice began appearing in her life. 3 years after beginning her transition, Elena had her first solo exhibition at a major gallery. The show, titled Invisible Waters, explored the hidden environmental costs of consumer culture through multimedia installations that combined painting, sculpture, and digital media. The exhibition was both critically acclaimed and financially successful. More importantly, Elena had found a way to integrate her artistic gifts with her authentic values and social concerns. She was making a living through work that felt meaningful and personally fulfilling. 5 years later, Elena's career had evolved into something she never could have planned. Rationally, She was creating large-scale environmental art installations for museums, teaching workshops on art as social activism, and collaborating with scientists and activists on projects that combined aesthetic beauty with ecological education. But the most significant transformation was internal. Elena had become more integrated, authentic, and alive. Her work flowed from genuine passion rather than external pressure. Her relationships were deeper and more honest because she was relating from authentic self rather than professional persona. I feel like I finally met who I actually was underneath all the roles I had been playing. Elena reflected. The soul release process wasn't trying to destroy my life, it was trying to give me my real life back. The pattern of success versus failure. Jung identified consistent patterns that distinguish successful from failed navigation of soul release. Recognition versus resistance. Successful individuals learn to recognize soul release signs as communications rather than pathologies. They become curious about what their psyche is trying to communicate rather than immediately seeking to eliminate uncomfortable symptoms. Gradual versus sudden. Successful transitions usually involve gradual, conscious preparation rather than sudden, dramatic changes. Individuals take time to understand their authentic direction before making major external modifications. Integration versus rejection. Success requires integrating rejected aspects of personality, shadow work, rather than maintaining rigid self-images. Failure often involves increasing psychological rigidity in response to internal change pressures. Support versus isolation. Successful individuals seek appropriate support for their transformation process, therapy, mentoring, spiritual guidance, or peer communities. Those who fail often isolate themselves or seek advice from people who are invested in maintaining their previous identity. Patience versus urgency. Successful soul release involves patience with the process of internal transformation. Failed approaches often involve either forcing change too quickly or resisting change completely. Meaning versus comfort. Those who succeed prioritize authentic meaning over psychological comfort. Those who fail prioritize comfort over growth, leading to increasing stagnation and eventual breakdown. The historical evidence is clear. The soul release process offers everyone the same fundamental choice between breakdown and breakthrough. The outcome depends entirely on your willingness to collaborate consciously with forces that are trying to liberate you from unconscious living. Jung's case studies demonstrate that your soul's intelligence is always working in your favor, even when the process feels difficult or frightening. The question isn't whether you can trust this process. Jung's evidence shows that it consistently produces positive outcomes when approached consciously. The question is whether you'll have the courage to recognize soul release when it begins in your own life, and whether you'll choose conscious collaboration over unconscious resistance. The path toward authentic becoming is available to everyone, but it requires the wisdom to distinguish between what serves your growth and what imprisons your potential. Jung's historical contrasts provide a clear map. Resist the process and face progressive deterioration. Embrace it consciously and discover who you were always meant to become. Jung's personal experience of soul release represents the most documented and influential individuation journey in psychological history. His willingness to undergo conscious transformation during what he called the most important experience of my life not only saved him from psychological breakdown, but gave birth to analytical psychology and provided humanity with tools for navigating the most challenging passages of human existence. The story begins in 1913 when Jung was 38 years old, at the absolute height of his professional success. He had a thriving private practice in Zurich, was internationally recognized as Freud's heir, a parent in psychoanalysis, and had achieved everything he thought he wanted in terms of career, family, and social status. But beneath this external success, Jung's soul was beginning its liberation process. The great disinterest, professional disillusionment. The first sign appeared as growing disillusionment with psychoanalysis and his role as Freud's disciple. Work that had once fascinated Jung began to feel mechanical and limiting. He found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about the unconscious that he had previously accepted without reservation. "I felt as though I were in a prison," Jung later wrote. "I was successful in every conventional sense, but I had lost contact with something essential in myself. My life felt like it belonged to someone else." Jung's disinterest wasn't intellectual disagreement with psychoanalytic theory. It was his soul's withdrawal of energy from a professional identity that had become too small for his expanding consciousness. He was being called toward discoveries that couldn't emerge while he remained identified as Freud's follower rather than his own authentic thinker. Most people in Jung's position would have interpreted this disillusionment as temporary burnout or professional stress. Jung recognized it as a communication from his deeper self about needed changes in his life direction. The phantom anxiety, confrontation with the unknown. The second sign manifested as what Jung described as a state of disorientation and overwhelming anxiety about the future of his work and identity. He began experiencing vivid dreams of catastrophic floods, rivers of blood, and European civilization being destroyed by ice and darkness. These weren't ordinary anxiety dreams. They were what Jung later recognized as compensatory messages from his unconscious about the collective psychological crisis that would soon manifest as World War I. But at the time, they felt like symptoms of approaching mental illness. "I was afraid I was going crazy," Jung admitted in his autobiography. "The rational mind that had served me so well in academic and clinical work seemed inadequate to understand what was happening in my psychological depths." But instead of seeking medication or trying to suppress these anxiety symptoms, Jung made a revolutionary decision. He would engage with them consciously and see what they had to teach him about his own psychological development and the needs of his time. The identity confusion, death of the academic self. The third sign appeared as profound confusion about his fundamental identity and purpose. Jung began questioning not just his professional role, but his basic understanding of himself as a rational, scientific thinker. "Who was I really?" Jung wrote in his Red Book. "I had been so identified with being a psychiatrist, a scientist, a disciple of Freud, that when those roles began to dissolve, I had no idea what remained." This identity confusion intensified after Jung's final break with Freud in 1913. Losing his position as heir to the psychoanalytic movement meant losing the external structure that had defined his professional identity for over a decade. Most people would have immediately sought to rebuild their professional reputation or align with another established psychological school. Jung chose instead to enter what he called the land of the dead, a deliberate descent into identity confusion to discover what lay beneath his socially constructed roles. The relationship mirrors professional isolation. The fourth sign manifested as increasing conflict and distance in Jung's professional relationships. Colleagues who had respected his work began viewing him with suspicion as he moved away from orthodox psychoanalysis. Students who had looked up to him became confused by his new interests in mythology, mysticism, and what he was beginning to call the collective unconscious. "I found myself increasingly isolated from the psychoanalytic community," Jung reflected. "People who had been allies began treating me like someone who had betrayed the scientific method and abandoned rational psychology." But Jung understood that these relationship changes reflected his internal transformation rather than external persecution. As he became more authentic to his own psychological discoveries, he naturally attracted different kinds of relationships and released connections based on shared adherence to limiting theoretical frameworks. The synchronicity storms, guidance from the unconscious. The fifth sign appeared as an intensification of meaningful coincidences that seemed to be guiding Jung toward new directions in his work and personal development. Books about mythology and comparative religion began appearing in his life precisely when he needed them. Patients arrived whose dreams and symptoms pointed toward archetypal patterns he was beginning to recognize. Most significantly, Jung began encountering what he called autonomous contents of the unconscious, inner figures like Philemon, Salome, and Elijah, who seemed to have independent existence and wisdom to share about psychological development. These figures were not fantasy creations, Jung insisted. They were genuine discoveries about the objective reality of the psyche, aspects of unconscious intelligence that exist beyond personal ego consciousness. The synchronicities provided confirmation that Jung's departure from conventional psychology was guided by deeper wisdom rather than personal delusion or professional ambition. The body's rebellion, near psychotic episodes. The sixth sign manifested as what Jung described as the most terrifying experience of my life, periods of near psychotic disorientation where he lost contact with consensus reality and entered what felt like altered states of consciousness. Jung experienced visions of mythological figures, heard voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, and felt himself being torn apart and reconstructed by forces beyond his conscious control. His body responded with physical symptoms that doctors couldn't diagnose: unexplained fevers, digestive problems, and periods of exhaustion that seemed to have no medical cause. I was afraid I was having a psychotic break, Jung wrote. Everything I had learned about mental health suggested that these experiences were pathological and dangerous, but I made a decision that changed my life and, I believe, the history of psychology. The revolutionary choice, conscious engagement. Instead of seeking hospitalization or medication, Jung made the unprecedented decision to engage consciously with his psychological breakdown. He began what he called the experiment with the unconscious, deliberately entering altered states of consciousness and recording his experiences in detailed notes and paintings. This decision required enormous courage. Jung risked his professional reputation, his family's security, and his personal sanity on the hypothesis that what appeared to be mental illness might actually be a natural process of psychological development that had been misunderstood by conventional psychiatry. I realized that I had two choices, Jung explained. I could fight against these experiences and probably end up in an asylum, or I could try to understand them as communications from aspects of the psyche that I had never encountered before. The Red Book, Documentation of Transformation. Jung spent 6 years documenting his soul release process in what became known as the Red Book, a leather-bound journal filled with detailed accounts of his inner dialogues, visions, and encounters with autonomous unconscious contents. The Red Book reveals Jung's systematic approach to engaging with psychological material that would have terrified most people into seeking immediate medical intervention. Instead of resisting his visions, Jung questioned them. Instead of dismissing his inner voices, he conversed with them. Instead of trying to return to normal consciousness, he explored these altered states as sources of psychological knowledge. Through this process, Jung discovered what became the foundational concepts of analytical psychology: archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, active imagination, and the psychological function of myth and symbol. My confrontation with the unconscious began in 1913 and lasted 6 years, Jung wrote. It was the most important experience of my life because it revealed dimensions of the psyche that had been completely unknown to academic psychology. The integration challenge, returning to the world. The most difficult aspect of Jung's soul release wasn't the descent into unconscious depths. It was learning to integrate his discoveries into practical life and professional work. Jung had to find ways to function in the ordinary world while remaining connected to the extraordinary psychological insights he had gained through his breakdown and breakthrough. This integration process took years and required developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ego's capacity to maintain relationship with both rational consciousness and unconscious wisdom without being possessed by either. Jung learned to be a practicing psychiatrist, university lecturer, husband, and father, while simultaneously maintaining active relationship with the inner figures and archetypal insights he had encountered during his confrontation with the unconscious. The greatest challenge wasn't going into the unconscious, Jung reflected. It was learning to live consciously in both worlds, the practical world of daily responsibilities and the symbolic world of psychological depths. The creative aftermath, birth of analytical psychology. Jung's willingness to undergo conscious soul release produced psychological insights that revolutionized understanding of human development and created entirely new approaches to therapy, education, and personal growth. The concepts Jung discovered during his breakdown became the foundation for analytical psychology, the idea that the unconscious contains not just repressed personal material, but collective wisdom about human psychological development. The recognition that psychological symptoms often represent the psyche's attempt to communicate about needed growth. The understanding that individuation is the central task of human existence. Jung's private soul release became humanity's gift. His willingness to risk everything to discover his authentic psychological insights provided tools that millions of people have used to navigate their own transformation processes. What appeared to be my personal breakdown became my greatest contribution to human knowledge, Jung observed. By allowing my soul to release my identification with conventional psychology, I discovered psychological truths that I never could have found through academic study alone. The ultimate validation, a life of authentic service. Jung lived another 50 years after completing his initial soul release process, during which he continued to deepen his psychological insights and serve individuals seeking authentic development. His later work, studies of alchemy, synchronicity, and the psychological significance of religious experience, all flowed from the foundation he had established during his confrontation with the unconscious. But more importantly, Jung's personal transformation created a template for conscious engagement with psychological crisis that has helped countless individuals recognize their own breakdown as potential breakthrough. Jung's story demonstrates that the soul release process isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to discover you. The aspects of identity, career, and worldview that feel like they're being torn away are often precisely the limitations that have been preventing you from accessing your authentic gifts and genuine contribution to the world. The experience taught me that what we call mental illness is often the psyche's attempt to heal itself, Jung concluded. Instead of suppressing these natural healing processes, we need to learn how to collaborate with them consciously. The personal becomes universal. Jung's individual soul release journey became a roadmap for anyone experiencing psychological crisis, identity confusion, or the call to authentic transformation. His detailed documentation of the process provides both inspiration and practical guidance for navigating the most challenging passages of human development. But perhaps most importantly, Jung's story reveals that your personal transformation isn't just about you. When you allow your soul to release what no longer serves and guide you toward your authentic gifts, you often discover that your individual healing serves collective healing as well. Jung's willingness to risk everything for authentic psychological development didn't just transform his own life, it provided humanity with new understanding of consciousness, creativity, and the unlimited potential for psychological growth throughout the lifespan. The question Jung's story raises for anyone experiencing soul release is this: what might be trying to be born through your own psychological crisis? What gifts might emerge if you had the courage to collaborate consciously with your own transformation process? Jung's legacy suggests that your breakdown might be the beginning of your greatest contribution to the world, but only if you're willing to trust the process and allow your soul to guide you toward who you were always meant to become. Jung identified 5 distinct stages in the soul release process, each with its own psychological dynamics, challenges, and opportunities for growth. Understanding this transformation arc helps you recognize where you are in your own individuation journey and what specific tasks each stage requires for successful navigation toward authentic becoming. This isn't a linear progression that you complete once and never revisit. Jung observed that individuation involves cyclical movement through these stages at deeper levels throughout life as consciousness continues to expand and evolve. Each cycle prepares you for more complex challenges and more sophisticated expressions of your authentic nature. Stage 1. The call to release. The transformation arc begins with subtle but persistent signals that something in your current life structure no longer fits your expanding consciousness. This isn't dramatic crisis, but rather a growing sense of restlessness, boredom, or vague dissatisfaction with previously fulfilling activities, relationships, or goals. Jung called this the call to adventure in psychological development, your soul's initial invitation to release identification with external structures that have become too small for your authentic becoming. The call often appears as questions that won't go away. Is this all there is? Jung didn't just theorize about the soul release process. He developed specific, practical techniques for collaborating with, rather than fighting against your psyche's natural intelligence. These aren't abstract concepts, but concrete daily practices that create space for your authentic self to communicate, guide, and gradually transform your life from unconscious survival to conscious becoming. The key insight underlying all of Jung's practical tools is this: your soul is always trying to communicate with you, but modern life creates so much mental noise that you can't hear its subtle guidance. These practices create pockets of silence, receptivity, and conscious engagement that allow deeper intelligence to emerge. Morning pages, catching the soul's voice. Jung discovered that the transition between sleep and waking consciousness creates a natural window for receiving communication from unconscious depths. During these liminal moments, the ego's defenses are relaxed and symbolic. Intuitive material can emerge more easily. Morning pages involve writing 3 pages of stream of consciousness material immediately upon waking, before checking phones, reading news, or engaging with external demands. This isn't journaling about your day or planning your schedule. It's creating space for whatever wants to emerge from unconscious depths. The process is deceptively simple. Wake up, grab pen and paper, and write continuously for 3 pages without editing, censoring, or directing the content. Write whatever comes to mind, no matter how trivial, repetitive, or strange it seems. Sarah, the executive we met earlier, discovered through morning pages that Her panic attacks weren't random anxiety, but her soul's specific communication about which work situations had become toxic to her authentic development. The pages would be filled with complaints about meetings that felt meaningless, projects that contradicted my values, and a growing sense that I was betraying something important in myself by continuing to excel in a role that had nothing to do with who I actually was. Morning pages bypass the rational mind's tendency to organize, justify, and control psychological content. They create direct access to the soul's unfiltered communications about what needs attention, what needs to be released, and what wants to emerge. Jung emphasized that morning pages aren't meant to be profound or meaningful every day. Most days they'll contain mundane complaints, random thoughts, and apparently trivial concerns. But over time, patterns emerge that reveal the soul's consistent messages about needed changes. The practice works because it honors the soul's natural communication style, associative, symbolic, and non-linear, rather than rational and goal-oriented. You're not trying to solve problems through morning pages. You're creating space for deeper intelligence to inform you about what's really happening in your psychological depths. Evening review, recognizing daily soul communications, while morning pages create receptivity to unconscious material. Evening review develops your capacity to recognize how the soul has been communicating with you throughout your conscious day. This practice trains you to identify the 6 signs of soul release as they appear in daily experience. Evening review involves spending 10-15 minutes before sleep reflecting on your day with specific attention to moments of disinterest, anxiety, confusion, relationship tension, synchronicity, or physical symptoms. Instead of dismissing these experiences as random occurrences, you explore them as potential communications from your authentic self. The process involves asking specific questions. What situations or activities felt draining or meaningless today? When did I experience unexplained anxiety or restlessness? Were there moments when I felt disconnected from my usual sense of identity? Did I notice any relationship dynamics that seemed unusual or significant? What coincidences or unexpected encounters occurred? How did my body respond to different situations throughout the day? Michael, a businessman experiencing soul release, used evening review to recognize that his chronic fatigue only appeared when he was working on projects that conflicted with his environmental values. I started noticing that I would feel energized during meetings about sustainability initiatives, but completely exhausted after sessions focused on maximizing profit regardless of ecological impact. My body was giving me precise information about what aligned with my authentic values. Evening review isn't about judging your experiences as good or bad, but about developing sensitivity to your soul's subtle guidance system. Over time, you begin to recognize patterns that reveal your authentic self's responses to different situations, relationships, and choices. Jung emphasized that most people miss their soul's daily communications because they're looking for dramatic signs rather than subtle patterns. Evening review trains you to recognize that your deepest intelligence is constantly providing feedback about what serves your growth and what limits your authentic development. Active imagination, direct dialogue with the unconscious. Active imagination is Jung's most sophisticated technique for engaging directly with unconscious contents and receiving guidance about the soul release process. Unlike meditation, which often involves emptying the mind, active imagination involves conscious collaboration with symbolic material that emerges from psychological depths. The basic technique involves entering a relaxed meditative state and allowing images, figures, or impressions to arise spontaneously. Instead of analyzing or controlling these images, you engage with them as if they were autonomous beings with their own intelligence and purpose. Elena, the artist who successfully transitioned from commercial work to environmental activism, used active imagination to dialogue with an inner figure she called the woman with dirty hands, a symbolic representation of her authentic creative nature that had been suppressed during years of creating polished corporate advertising. Through regular conversations with this inner figure, Elena discovered specific guidance about transitioning her career, which commercial clients to release gradually, which environmental organizations to approach, how to maintain financial stability during the transition, and how to integrate her artistic gifts with social activism. Active imagination sessions typically last 20-30 minutes and follow a consistent structure, relaxation, allowing images to emerge, engaging in dialogue or interaction, and recording insights in writing or artistic expression. The key principle is what Jung called holding the tension, remaining consciously present during the experience without either dismissing the images as meaningless fantasy or becoming completely identified with them as literal reality. Jung discovered that active imagination provides access to psychological guidance that's far more sophisticated than anything available to rational consciousness alone. The unconscious seems to contain creative solutions to life problems that the ego could never generate through analysis or planning. Dream Journal, decoding nightly guidance. Jung considered dreams to be direct communications from the soul about psychological development needs, life direction changes, and individuation tasks. Dream journaling involves recording and engaging with dream content as a source of practical guidance about the soul release process. The practice begins with keeping a journal and pen beside your bed and recording dreams immediately upon waking before engaging with external information or activities. Record not just the narrative content, but also emotions, body sensations, and overall atmosphere of the dream experience. Jung's approach to dream interpretation focuses on personal associations rather than universal symbols. Instead of looking up dream meanings in books, you explore what specific dream elements mean to you personally and how they might relate to your current life situation. David, the businessman learning to integrate his anima, discovered through dream work that his soul was trying to prepare him for a career transition toward work that integrated his business skills with artistic and humanitarian concerns. I kept having dreams about building bridges between different worlds, corporate boardrooms and artist studios, financial districts and nature preserves. The dreams were showing me possibilities I had never considered consciously. Dream journaling becomes particularly valuable during periods of soul release because dreams often provide symbolic previews of psychological changes that haven't yet emerged in conscious awareness. They can reveal authentic desires, warn about situations that don't serve your development, and suggest creative solutions to apparent dilemmas. Jung emphasized that dreams use the soul's natural language, symbolic, emotional, and associative rather than linear and logical. Learning to engage with dream content develops your capacity to communicate with non-rational aspects of intelligence that contain wisdom unavailable to ego consciousness alone. Body awareness practice, physical intelligence. Jung recognized that the body contains its own form of intelligence about what serves authentic development and what hinders psychological growth. Body awareness practice involves developing sensitivity to physical responses as communications from your soul about environmental, relational, and vocational alignment. The practice involves spending 5-10 minutes daily in quiet attention to physical sensations, energy levels, and bodily responses to different thoughts, memories, or situations. Instead of trying to control or change physical experiences, you observe them as sources of information about psychological dynamics. Lisa, a consultant experiencing body rebellion, used this practice to recognize that her chronic fatigue wasn't a medical condition, but her soul's refusal to invest life energy in work that had become misaligned with her authentic values. When I paid attention consciously, I noticed that I felt energized when thinking about certain types of projects and completely drained when considering others. My body was providing precise feedback about what aligned with my authentic development. Body awareness practice can include noticing how different people affect your energy, how various environments influence your physical comfort, and how specific activities or decisions create expansion or contraction in your physical being. Jung observed that people experiencing soul release often notice increased physical sensitivity as their authentic self begins to emerge from beneath layers of conditioning and performance. What seemed like problematic sensitivity can become valuable guidance when approached consciously. Synchronicity tracking, recognizing environmental support. Jung discovered that periods of psychological transition often involve increases in meaningful coincidences that seem to support movement toward authentic development. Synchronicity tracking involves maintaining awareness of unusual coincidences and exploring their potential significance for your individuation process. The practice involves keeping a simple record of meaningful coincidences, unexpected encounters, and unusual events that seem to carry personal significance or point toward new directions. Instead of dismissing these experiences as random, you explore their potential relevance to your psychological development. Rachel, a mother experiencing relationship mirrors, used synchronicity tracking to recognize how external circumstances were supporting her individuation process. I kept encountering books about women who had transformed their lives in midlife, meeting people who had made similar transitions, and receiving unexpected opportunities that aligned perfectly with changes I was considering but hadn't discussed with anyone. Synchronicity tracking helps you recognize that the soul release process often involves environmental support that becomes visible only when you're paying conscious attention to meaningful patterns rather than focusing exclusively on obvious linear cause and effect relationships. Jung emphasized that synchronicities aren't magic. They're evidence of the unconscious mind's capacity to recognize and attract circumstances that support psychological development when you're aligned with authentic growth rather than fighting against it. Creative expression, giving form to transformation. The final tool involves using artistic expression, drawing, painting, writing, music, movement, to give form to psychological content that's emerging during the soul release process. Creative expression provides a non-verbal outlet for energies and insights that can't be captured through rational analysis alone. This isn't about creating professional quality art, but about allowing psychological material to express itself through creative media. Jung filled his red book with paintings of his visions, not because he considered himself a visual artist, but because images could contain psychological content that words couldn't capture. The practice involves setting aside time regularly for unstructured creative expression, allowing whatever wants to emerge through artistic media without concern for skill level or artistic merit. The goal is expression rather than impression, communication rather than creation of beautiful objects. Thomas, an attorney who discovered his soul was calling him toward teaching, used creative expression to explore his changing sense of identity through collage, combining images that represented his legal background with pictures related to education, mentoring, and working with young people. Creative expression often reveals psychological insights that rational analysis misses entirely. It provides access to symbolic, emotional, and intuitive dimensions of the soul release process that complement but can't be replaced by cognitive understanding. Integration and daily application. Jung emphasized that these practices work best when integrated into daily life, rather than treated as special techniques reserved for crisis periods. The goal is developing ongoing relationship with your soul's intelligence so that you can receive guidance continuously rather than only during dramatic breakdown periods. Start with one or two practices that resonate with your temperament and lifestyle. Morning pages work well for people who appreciate written reflection. Active imagination appeals to individuals comfortable with symbolic thinking. Body awareness suits people who are naturally sensitive to physical experience. The key principle underlying all these practices is the same: creating space for your authentic self to communicate about what needs to be released and what wants to emerge. Your soul is always trying to guide you toward your most creative, purposeful, and fulfilling life, but it requires your conscious collaboration to manifest this guidance in practical reality. These tools transform the soul release process from something that happens to you into something you actively participate in. Instead of being a victim of psychological forces beyond your understanding, you become a conscious collaborator in your own transformation toward authentic becoming.